Okay, now we're good to go with the recording. I am so happy to introduce Kimberly Jones, who is the president for the Council for Opportunity in Education. If you are not a COE member, I would definitely say be a COE member. There are many, many benefits to being in COE. The wonderful advocacy, the support, in not just grant writing time, but all the way through. And it's really great to have COE in our corner. Also, this webinar is being presented by the McNair Association of Professionals, and we opened it up to the entire McNair community. So many of you on this call may not be members of MAP, and we would love to encourage you to check that out. You can visit our website, mcnairmap.org. Carrie or Stephen, would you put a link, please, in the chat for me? And you can find information about how to join there. As a reminder, an institutional membership to MAP is, you can use grant funds for that. We are an organization that really just supports McNair professionals. And it is definitely something that we have all gotten a lot of benefit from. And this webinar, just like this, is just one little thing that we do. We will also be hosting another COE website later in the summer, or webinar later in the summer, and that will only be available to MAP members. So I would really encourage you to join. So Kimberly, back to Kimberly. She has graciously given her time today to give us a little lesson in TRIO advocacy. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Kimberly.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good to see you. I'm going to jump right in because there's a lot of content to get through in the limited amount of time we have. And I'm really grateful and want to extend my thanks to the McNair Association of Professionals, Advisory Committee, Leadership Board, etc. You might recall, those of you who've been doing this for a little while, that during the Trump administration, McNair specifically was targeted for elimination. And then during the Obama administration, the administration removed $10 million out of the McNair program and moved it into upper bound math science. And so generally speaking, even though TRIO is one singular unit, the McNair program in particular is probably the lowest hanging fruit at a time when fewer and fewer people are seeing the value of higher education. The easiest thing to target is postgraduate preparation. And so it's really important that the McNair community is aware of where we've come from and is well positioned to fight for what could be in the future. Because we know the differences our students' lives make in the work they do, but we have to continue to fight and defend that. And, in putting together this presentation, I was reminded that the only reason why TRIO still exists 60 years after it was conceived of is because a group of ordinary people decided to make that happen. And so I want to really just encourage you all. I hope you find inspiration in the presentation. And by all means, if there are burning questions, plop them in the chat. I'm going to ask Kim and Stephen to help me as far as, recognizing anything that needs to be answered. But we will also hopefully have time for questions at the end. Here's my PowerPoint, and I'll be sure to share this with your leadership as well, so you will have it. So let's get to the beef. We're going to start off first with just a very, very brief history of higher education in the United States and the origins of the college access movement. From there, we'll talk more in depth about TRIO history specifically and getting into some of McNair's legislative history and then what we need to ensure our future. And so higher education in the United States goes back to 1636 when John Harvard founded an institution in Massachusetts to basically train white Christian men for the ministry. That was really the objective of not just Harvard, but most of the institutions founded in the very earliest days of our country's history. It was for white Christian men to go into ministry. In 1862, however, President Lincoln signed into law the first Morrill Act. And at that time, tells you how challenging our history is. It basically provided states with land that was probably stolen from tribes to provide higher education institutions. But this Morale Act was the first deliberate attempt to ensure that higher education was accessible across the country, again, by seizing, stealing from Native American tribes. The second Morrill Act happened in 1890, and that was really targeted at the former Confederate states. And the deal was you either had to let Black people into your schools or you had to use this money to build schools for them. And so as a result of that, the majority of our HBCUs came into existence because certain places were not willing to integrate. And so that's really, sometimes you hear when you talk about HBCUs, the 1890 schools, and that's really where the majority of those institutions came from out of the Second Morrill Act. And of course, we all know about the GI Bill in an attempt to prevent another depression when we were having these returning servicemen and women, well, servicemen actually at that point, coming back from World War II. The government made an investment in sending people to college. Now, again, because America's history is what it is, we do know that these resources and funds were not necessarily equitably distributed, but certainly it was the first massive influx of people who previously had not gone into higher education into college. But it was with the next president following FDR, Harry Truman, where we had the first commission to really address higher education as a national need. And a fun fact about Harry Truman, he's the only only president in the 20th century to not have a college degree. And so in his honor, as opposed to having a statue or a museum, they have the Truman Scholarship, which he wanted to provide for students to be able to go to study, to prepare for a career in public service. So in 1947, the Truman Commission report identified 5 barriers to enrolling and graduating from college, which sadly in 2024, many of these same barriers exist, but they identified them as race, gender, religion, geography, and socioeconomic background. On this next sheet, you'll see that the commission made 10 recommendations. Again, very similar to some of the same recommendations we're seeing today come out of different policy shops and being advanced on Capitol Hill to help ensure greater access for folks who were, in fact, limited by things like race, religion, socioeconomic background. Then the United States really got animated around education when Sputnik happened. There was a realization that if we want to be able to compete with our, at that time, enemies, we needed to double down on our investment, and particularly in the areas of math and science. And so what's interesting to note that the National Defense Act, which is the result of Sputnik, you more than doubled the number of college students in the country between 1960 and 1970. And while all of these things are happening in the background, you know, you've got post-war veterans moving into higher education. You've got the National Defense Act creating opportunity for people to go into higher education. There's a lot of social, racial, and economic unrest happening. And collectively, I just like to call this time the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Everything ranging from the decision to desegregate public schools in Brown versus Board of Education to the high school students walking out in East LA because of unfair conditions. All of this really laid the groundwork for what would happen under the administration of President Johnson, who of course succeeded President Kennedy following his assassination. And of course, many scholars have said, if not for that assassination, there would not have been the appetite to advance many of the civil rights pieces of legislation that we saw in the following years. I am not, well, I'm gonna try to play this clip. This is a really fantastic clip of an address by LBJ to Congress in March of 1965, announcing his efforts to declare war on poverty. Let me see if this will work. It will not. So I will not show it at this time. And it gets a little long, but it's a lot of, again, a lot of the language is very similar to some of the same arguments we have today around why we should invest in education for everyone. So with the war on poverty came the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. What's so interesting is that nowhere in that bill is the word upward bound or TRIO. All of those terms would come later. What did happen, though, was that the act created an authority for the federal government to be able to do demonstration projects. And one of those demonstration projects was Upward Bound at about, I want to say, 15 campuses starting in the summer of 1965. Also in 1965, you had the Higher Education Act, and that did two things. One, it created the first need-based aid for students, but then it also created Talent Search. And the reason, fun fact, the reason why Talent Search is called Talent Search is because at that time, again, it was primarily people from higher classes who were going into post-secondary education. And so as Congress was writing this bill, they said to Congress, well, where do you want us to find these talented individuals from these backgrounds to go into college? Hence the name Talent Search. By the time you get to 1968, we are reauthorizing the Higher Education Act for the first time. Every bill only exists for a certain number of years before it must be reauthorized. They did a couple things there. They moved Upward Bound out of what was the Office of Economic Opportunity to the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. They also created a new program, which had a terrible name, Special Services for Disadvantaged Students. It's what we today know as Student Support Services. And these three programs, so Talent Search, Upward Bound, and SSS, were moved under Title IV, which is the financial aid section of the legislation. And Congress affirmatively chose to pair it that way, recognizing that you needed the academic support as well as the financial aid in order to get to and through college. In 1972 was the next reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, and you saw the educational opportunity centers come to life. And then in 1976, we created the TRIO training grants, which basically gave authority for institutions like COE, like MAP even, to apply for grants to provide training for professionals in the TRIO programs. So as all these things are happening in the 1970s, what's happening simultaneously is that TRIO educators in locations across the country are starting to talk to each other. At that time, again, there was no office, there was no Department of Education. There was the Office of Health, Education, and Welfare, and they had regional offices. And so, for instance, if you were a TRIO program operating out of Wyoming, your regional office was located in Denver, or Region 8. And so what would happen is at these gatherings of the TRIO educators in these regions, they just started talking to each other and decided to form their own associations, much like you all with MAP, in order to defend, protect the programs. And so the first regional association to exist was our Southwestern Association, followed by what is now known as the Educational Opportunity Association. And in 1977, leaders from what was then the 10 different regional groups came together at a meeting in New Orleans and decided to form a national organization that was known as the National Coordinating Council of Educational Opportunity Associations, the precursor to COE. Nope. And just here are all the association logos as we know them today. So again, COE, again, forming a true coalition to have a presence in Washington. And specifically for the next round of reauthorization, we had missed 68, we had missed 72, we had missed 76. The goal was to be ready to play by the time you got to the 1980 reauthorization. One really important point that it always merits repeating, something that really distinguishes TRIO from many other types of support programs, is that we are a multiracial, as Dr. Mitchum would call it, a functioning rainbow coalition. A deliberate decision was made by the early organizers that we were not going to divide ourselves along racial lines, and that our community would reflect the entirety of who we served. And so that's why I love whenever you go to our national meetings, it's not just one group. You see people from every racial background, from every zip code, from every pocket of the country and our territories represented at our meetings. And that's really the unifying thread of the work we've done. Now, here's a fantastic example of advocacy at work. As I mentioned, we started in the late 70s to really get organized as a national unit. And during the 1970s, TRIO funding was frozen. It was frozen at about $70 million. And anybody in DC will tell you that that kind of signals a soon coming death for programs. There's not interest in growing it. But then in late 1977, you start to see increases in the funding. And basically that's a result of these two people on the screen right here. You have Shirley Chisholm of Brooklyn. She was the first legislator to actually take TRIO seriously, to adopt it as an issue. And what she did, she essentially introduced our founding president, Dr. Arnold Mitchum, and our community to Congressman Lou Stokes. Lou Stokes was the first, I believe, Black person to sit on the House Appropriations Committee. And that is the committee that gives away all the money. And so she cultivated that relationship. And of course, Mr. Stokes became a great champion for TRIO throughout his tenure in Congress until he retired in the late 90s. And so again, you can see over time how the resources just grew and grew. And let's see if it'll let me play this clip. Okay. This is a clip where Dr. Mitchum talks about Shirley Chisholm and her role in introducing us to Mr. Stokes and sort of the early days of advocacy within TRIO. And it's an interesting case study. So let me see if I can play this. Can you hear this?
Shirley Chisholm, this woman, Shirley Chisholm of Brooklyn.
It's really low.
She was the first person in Congress who did something other than look pat us on my head when we went to see her. She talked substance, talked legislation, didn't say, do you want to stand over here and get your picture this away? That do you want, do you want to sit on my lap or be sit on your, all that silliness. Mrs. Chisholm was a serious woman, and she fought for that which was good and right. So I had the privilege of working closely with her. In fact, they had the privilege one time to dance with Mrs. Chisholm. We weren't lovers. Don't start no mess. Don't start no mess. It was in New Hampshire. It was long after she had done a lot of great things for us. Our colleagues in the New England Association created an award named after Mrs. Chisholm, and she was there to receive it and get it started and all that. And I happened to be there, always happened to be somewhere, and had the honor of dancing with the great lady. What she did was offered some amendments in the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act in 1976. And that was an important reauthorization because it gave me and a lot of others an experience, a training. We didn't know what a reauthorization was. I wasn't a political science major in college. And those people who were my closest colleagues weren't either. Ms. Hoyler, for example, she was studying theology, philosophy, and anthropology. What did she know about politics? Doing worse. Some of them were physical education. So you know what they know about politics. So anyway, except for the football player, they're good. I like the football because they knew how to bump them and knock them down. And that was a good thing to understand. So it was very important what happened in 1976, that experience. And again, Mrs. Chisholm drove that. She drove that. She also, in 1976 in the fall, went to the EOA conference in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and dealt with another problem that we had. It was our problem, an internal problem. Many of my colleagues did not want to get involved in politics. They hated it, they deplored it, said it's a nasty, dirty business. I'm an educator. I'm a holy man. I guess. I don't know. And so I don't do those ugly, nasty things. Mrs. Chisholm addressed that issue and reminded all of us that, folks, politics is everywhere, even in the churches. And some of them understood that. And her message and her stridency and all began to weigh in her credibility, and people listened to her the way they would listen to me and others and said, oh, you know, gee, okay. And so broke down some of that initial resistance. There were people who wouldn't even refuse to pay their dues to associations. Say, I don't give money to adults. I don't do that. If I got some extra money, I give it to my students, you know, and on, set up all these false dichotomies. It was a very ugly and difficult situation. Mrs. Chisholm attacked that apathy. She also, after the educational amendments of 1976, introduced us to Louis Stokes, the congressman from Ohio, who became our champion from 1977 until he retired in 1998. And he was a blessed man. And you've heard this story before, some of you, but I'll tell it again. I'll never forget when I met him. He was sitting behind this big desk. And here I was sitting in front of him, and I knew he was the big man. His brother had been the first Black mayor of Cleveland, and he sat on the appropriations committee, so I was awed and impressed with all that sort of stuff. And my problem was that the appropriation for Trio hadn't raised a dime in 4 years. It was stuck at 70.3 million. So I laid that on Mr. Stokes. I said, hey, you know, we haven't gotten the increase, and, you know, implied, isn't that kind of unfair? I didn't use the word racist, but I said, you know, you think that's kind of ugly? And he looked back at me and he said, what's wrong with the program? And I said, oh my God, to myself. I wanted to, but you know, I didn't. You have to learn how to control your ego and your in politics and your facial expression, and don't give your game away. Okay? Because I was angry and upset and disappointed and hurt when he said, what's wrong with your program? But what do you mean what's wrong with the program? You wait a minute. Here you sitting behind that big desk and your brother the mayor, you ask me what's wrong, and hey, you look just like me. Hey, what's wrong with the program? At any rate, I kept my cool, worked out, and it worked out very well. Because as you know, he led the move that broke the fever of the 70 million in a supplemental for FY 77 that got moved from 70 million to 85 million in February of 1977, came back in June of 77 and gave us more money and raised the appropriation of 115 for you take those combined increases, and it was about a 64% increase. I don't think we've ever done that well in one ever. But you know, again, our base was so damn small. It was $70 million. Okay,
well, let me stop there. So that's, again, I like to share that because just a great illustration, again, of real-time, real-life advocacy, and the impact of knowing the right people, being at the right place, the right time. And as Dr. Mitchum says, you don't give your game away, you know, keep your cool. And so let me get back to the presentation. Oop. Okay. Okay, let me share my screen again. There we go. Okay, and so, you know, Mr. Stokes, again, under his leadership, we were able to really see funding increase, and you really see an explosion in the 1990s. And that's largely because, well, you had Mr. Stokes on the Democratic side. By this time, TRIO had been around for a couple of decades. And we saw our first member of Congress to serve, who was a TRIO product, and that was Mr. Henry Bonilla, a Republican of Texas. And so he was added to the Appropriations Committee. And so between Mr. Bonilla and Mr. Stokes, they increased our appropriations by hundreds of millions of dollars. So we're starting to see the fruits of our work in a real way. You get to the 1980 reauthorization, and this is really our Magna Carta in the world of TRIO. This is when TRIO leaders from across the country were organized enough and respected enough to be brought to the table to really have a voice. And it was particularly the staff of Representative Bill Ford, who was the chairman of the subcommittee on higher education, who really gave the TRIO community the license to essentially rewrite the law. And they accepted our recommendations without modification. And some of the biggest things to note is that in the 1980 reauthorization, we brought uniformity to program eligibility. To be eligible for TRIO, you now had to be from a low-income background and a first-generation college student, or potential first-generation college student. And I always like to point out to people that that is the first time that the concept of a first-generation college student appeared in legislation. It was in the TRIO section of the law. We own that. It also created prior experience, another something that is near and dear to the TRIO community. It essentially helped create continuity, that if you're doing your program well and doing things right, you would have an opportunity, a better opportunity to maintain your funding as you go into the years to compete, and also provided multi-year grants. Here's something that's particularly of note for the McNair community. When you get to 1986, it was Senator Paul Simon of Illinois who introduced the concept of what would become the McNair Post-Baccalaureate Achievement Program. Initially, it was authorized under SSS to have programs to prepare students for doctoral study. This happened during the 1986 reauthorization. Of course, we know that year there was the Challenger tragedy. And so it was actually Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, the great segregationist, who called Dr. Mitchum and called Cheryl McNair, the widow of Ronald E. McNair, to ask for permission to name the program after Dr. McNair. And so in the higher education technical amendments, they specifically named the program the Ronald E. McNair Post-Baccalaureate Achievement Program. But, and here's a great lesson in legislation, you can legislate whatever you want, but if there's no money behind it, it doesn't exist. And so because there was no interest from the administration at that time, we're in the late 70s, so this would have been the Carter administration, there was no money allocated to McNair. As I understand it, it wasn't Patricia Roberts, but there was a similar program designed, I believe, also for students of color to help them getting into the advanced degree space. And the administration did not address this need. They did not want to address it through TRIO. And so for 3 fiscal years, even though the language was on the books, it existed on paper, it did not exist in fact because there was no funding behind it. And so in 1990, fiscal year 1990, the TRIO community fought to get legislation put into the the appropriations language that required the department to fund the McNair program. And so then you had the first, I think it was 14 programs that started in 1990. By the time you get to 1992, we formally adopted the name TRIO because I remember there was initially those 3 programs, Talent Search, Upward Bound, and SSS. And the last reauthorization took place actually in 2008. So it's well overdue for reauthorization, but some fine points of that bill, it revoked what was a very unethical evaluation of the Upward Bound program that required them to recruit double the number of students you needed to create a treatment and control group. We got that outlawed. We extended all grants to 5 years. We created an appeals process. Even, I know we love that appeals process so much, messy as it is, but it was the first time we actually got an appeals process into the law. And you can see on the PowerPoint, there are several other elements that were added in the 2008 reauthorization. And just as a point of information, there is not specific legislation for Upward Bound, Math Science, or Veterans Upward Bound, but rather the Department of Education uses the Upward Bound authority to administer those programs. And that was implemented Veterans Upward Bound in 1973 and Upward Bound Math Science in 1992. So we are at the end of the formal presentation. One thing that was not included in this PowerPoint, and that's I will take the fall for that. And I mentioned this at the top. In 2012, I want to say, FY 2012, just like the administration did not want to put money into McNair back in, fiscal year 1987, in fiscal year 2012, when the Obama White House issued its budget request to Congress, you looked at each of the programs and you saw that they'd moved $10 million away from McNair and put it into upper bound math science. Now, the stated reason for this was that they wanted to put a greater emphasis on young people coming up into STEM. The reality is TRIO had been bleeding students, and we'd really been beating the Obama administration over the head about that. And so their solution was, well, you can get 2 upper bound math science kids for the cost of 1 McNair kid. And that's how that happened. And I will tell you, I consider this to be one of my greatest professional losses. We did everything short of raise Ronald McNair from the grave. His wife and children were both involved in advocacy, came to DC several times. We had meetings at the White House, at the Department of Education, all levels of Congress, but we were not able to reverse that. Thankfully, in FY 2017, when the Trump administration proposed eliminating McNair, we were able to defeat that, thanks mostly to our friends on the Congress, particularly friends who are of a Republican persuasion. And even most recently in FY 23, when several programs lost funding, largely, arguably, but largely in part due to the competitive preference priority that gave extra points for programs that were at minority serving institutions, yet several longstanding programs that, while not MSIs, certainly had been successful in producing students of color and other underrepresented students out of the McNair program. And through pressure from our community, when Congress finished its appropriation for the year, they they instructed the Department of Education to fund down the slate, so we were able to get some of those programs back. And so those are just a couple of examples of our advocacy at work and why it's important to stay involved, because again, it took, from the time the grant competition was released until the following spring, so almost 9 months, but we got it done. And so that's just an example of us working together to advocate for our program, because if not for those interventions, certainly McNair would not be where it is today. Back in 2012, we lost, I want to say 50 programs because of that funding change. And we've slowly been fighting and clawing our way back. And so we just have to make sure that we're very persistent and consistent in our advocacy. And so with that, let me stop and see if there are questions or even comments from folks.
Thank you, Kimberly. I would, since there are so many of us on this call, I'd love for people to put questions or comments in the chat, just because I think it might be a little bit difficult with people like trying to talk over one another. So, and while people are doing that, I do want to let you all know that the follow-up webinar for this will be on Monday, July 29th. And in that webinar, Kimberly's going to give us kind of some nuts and bolts, things that we can do to continue the advocacy that she talked about today, and things that are specifically targeted towards McNair. So, first question, what gives you the most hope as you navigate both wins and policy losses in your advocacy work while navigating so much volatility? What advice would you give McNair practitioners as they navigate these turbulent times?
That's a great question. And I will tell you, sometimes it does get discouraging. And it's funny, my mom lives with me, and her favorite pastime is watching cable news. And so when I come home at the end of the day, I'm like, Ma, you've got to turn that off. I only know a little bit, and I know what they're telling you is not right. We're in an environment where politics has become the new reality show. And it's very easy to get discouraged by what you hear, what you see. But the reality is, in my experience, I've been doing this for a long time, most members of Congress, most of them, even the ones who were showboating on TV, most of them are decent human beings. they don't believe half the stuff they're saying out loud. They're playing to their base because they want to make sure they get reelected. And most people can agree that having our students get a good education is a good thing. It's good for the country. It's good for the economy. There might be some division about how we do that and how we pay for it, but most people can support the concept of a person coming from a low-income background who is potential first generation of college having an opportunity because they're willing to work for that opportunity. It really appeals, especially again, to a lot of our conservative members. It appeals to that whole bootstrap mentality. And so that's really what gives me some hope. And also meeting the students. We actually just had a group of students here today visiting DC. They were to visit a couple colleges. They're going to some Smithsonian's. And just meeting them. I met a young man who wants to be a lawyer. He's already graduated from high school. He's enrolling in college in the fall, and he's asking questions about what can he do to get an internship on Capitol Hill. And so meeting the students and knowing that we're here fighting for them keeps me motivated. And I hope it continues to keep you motivated as well. I stay up to speed on what's happening on campuses through the trade press. And I know it's a uncertain time for a lot of us, but we persevere, because if we don't fight for our students, who will? Here's an interesting, oh yeah. So there's a comment about the SAT and the changes in the purpose. I will say that educating students is largely a lower priority for most institutions. I mean, they're employers. They're employers in your communities, and they're thinking about, dealing with the unions. They're thinking about keeping, student unrest tamped down. Whether or not the students actually get a high quality education is going to make them prepared for the world falls a little bit lower on the priority list. And that's, again, why our work is so important, because and I know we only serve a fraction of those we could serve, but nobody's really looking out for students the way that we are. So, yeah.
We have another question. In your presentation, you mentioned the importance of advocacy. How do we get out of the mindset of I'm an educator, this isn't my job, I'm focused on my students, and how do we get involved?
Okay, so as an educator, this actually is a part of your job. This is the unwritten, unspoken part of your job. Because if you don't do the advocacy, the programs will not exist. So you'll be out of a job. So you can look at it that way. I mean, that's the most crass way to put it. Because your advocacy can't just be at the individual level. It has to be at the campus level, and it has to be in the political. And like the clip where Dr. Mitchum talked about, politics is everywhere. You're constantly having to negotiate your way on campuses, and we constantly have to negotiate with Capitol Hill and the powers that be. This is very much, other duties as assigned. Because again, if you don't do the advocacy work, you won't be there. TRIO will not be there to serve the students. And I don't say this to be hyperbolic. I mean, the House just released legislation that, now last year they zeroed it out altogether, but it cut federal work study in half, and it cut something else in half. I think it's SEOG, and it got rid of C campus. Now, the good news is that bill is not going to go anywhere in the Senate because it's controlled by a different party. They're going to have to come together and negotiate, and likely everything will be saved, but we're not going to see any growth. And so again, if we have to keep people, and this is, okay, depending on how deep you want to get with it. There's the work of being an advocate on your campus. There's the work of advocating with your members of Congress, but at a larger level, and this is something that's completely separate from anything you do with your students or in your official capacity. But as a citizen, I really encourage people to get involved with local politics, whether it's volunteering for a campaign, whether it's giving money to a candidate. And here's the reason why. You got to keep our friends in places where they can support us. If they're not in office, they can't help us. And a lot of people who support issues that we care about, they don't take corporate PAC money. They come from small, impoverished districts. So that's why it was such a statement to have our alum, Reverend Raphael Warnock, get reelected. Because again, it was people who just, I mean, he's a preacher. He's not a rich person. He's not coming with a trust fund and a treasure trove. He's one of 12 kids, only want to go to college. But the fact that people poured into the state to support him because they wanted to see him in the Senate. And that's the kind of activism and the attitude we have to have. I know it's so overwhelming because trust me, like I said, I come home, I'm like, turn off the news because, good news doesn't sell papers. It doesn't, get clicks. It doesn't get ratings. And so you have to kind of drown out the noise and surround yourself by like-minded people who are on the same path as you.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any other questions, but I have one, so I'll just ask you. I know you've said in the past that it doesn't really matter whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans in charge, that, kind of advocacy is always the same, but are there specific different strategies? I'm just thinking about coming up on the presidential election and how we might advocate now differently to how we might advocate after the election, depending on what happens.
So let me say this with respect to just in the case of trio funding, et cetera, et cetera. I'm saying this more plainly and more glibly than it is true, but it almost doesn't matter who's president, because at the end of the day, it's the Congress that controls what happens with us. The president puts a budget request out there, and typically with the party of that president, they will use that as their baseline, and the other party uses it as they put it in that nice blue recycling bin. What we saw during the Trump administration was even the Republicans on the Hill did not really pay it too much attention. I can't say that would happen again in a second term, but our bread and butter is the U.S. Congress, because the Congress disposes. They are the ones who actually, so the president can propose whatever they like. It's the Congress that actually makes the determination of what happens. What was the other part of your question about? Oh yeah, Democrats versus, okay. Don't make an assumption. So for instance, it's easy to assume if someone has an R next to their name that they'd be hostile to Trio or giving money to Trio. When in fact, it's primarily been Republican members who we've seen our largest increases under Republican rule in Congress. Some of our biggest champions are Republicans in Congress. And I've had members say to me, I can't vote with you, but here's what I'm going to go have a conversation with the chairman about this. That's the kind of, and that's the real support. Not to say we don't mind people signing letters and things like that, but what are you going to do for us in the cloakroom? That is the kind of support that only comes through having a grassroots knowledge of the program. So inviting them to your campuses to see what the students are doing, because you can't care about something you haven't seen. With Democrats, same thing. You can't assume, oh, they love, and I'm a card-carrying Democrat and having dinner tonight at the Democratic Club. But Democrats love everything. And so they've got a lot of people to take care of. So we're competing against Head Start. We're competing against Title I. We're competing against Pell. There's so many education programs and interests out there. We have to, elbow our way to get airspace. And so you just can't assume, oh, I'm represented by a Democrat, I'm good. You've got to fight to be at the top of their priority list.
All right, thank you. I don't see any other questions. Anthony shared a great article. Again, Anthony, if you'll just email me that to me separately, I'll go ahead and attach it with all of the information from this. I do want to give you a little bit of time, Kimberly, to give us our homework assignment for the next webinar. Yeah.
Yes, this is, we're McNair scholars, are we not? We like to research. And so for your next session, your homework is to research who represents you in the U.S. House of Representatives and in the U.S. Senate. As a reminder, you have one House representative and 2 senators for each state. And just who are they? What committees do they serve on? What are their top priority issues, and have they supported Trio? So for instance, on our website, we have lists of people who signed on to our letters in the past, people who've spoken at our conferences. Just dig around a little bit and see. Talk to your colleagues. They can probably tell you, oh, Congressman so-and-so loves Trio, or Senator so-and-so hates. There's less than 5 people I could count to say, oh, they don't like Trio. So most members have at least lukewarm thought about Trio, whereas most tend to have a favorable attitude about Trio. But yeah, that is your homework. And again, they may not be on any committees that impact us, but they could have colleagues that are. And so you never know who can be a friend to us. So, but primarily, we're always interested in the members who sit on the education committees and who sit on the appropriations committees.
Thank you for that. I again want to thank Kimberly for her time today. This has been incredibly helpful. I think a lot of us have known some of this, but I'm sure everybody learned something today. And especially for those of us that are new to the TRIO community, this was a great foundation for us as we move forward. I'm gonna go ahead and let everyone go unless there's just any last minute questions. I greatly appreciate everyone coming. And again, if you are not a MAP member, I really hope that you will consider joining, as this is just a tiny taste of the way that we support our community. So again, thank you so much, Kimberly, for coming. We look forward to hearing from you again on July 29th. And it was great to see everybody, and we'll talk with you guys soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Kim.
Take care.